All right. So we were just more or less settling on a plan for today. I would like to very briefly review the structure of V, since V is our absolute, incorporating a bit more of the material than we did in our last diagram. Then I think it would be nice, in order to motivate where we're going, to read a little bit about the absolute directly. And then I thought we would spend most of our time reading together through at least the inaccessibles, and then we can decide whether we want to read through the compacts together or just discuss them briefly, because they don't play as much of a role as you might think, except in filling out the schema of below, outside, or the outside, right, inside, above, for generating large infinities. And they're way less important to the argument than measurable cardinals, or what he calls complete cardinals. But I dissent. I won't do that. Sorry if it gets annoying. Right. The compact cardinals clearly aren't as important. So maybe we skip over some of that and look at the beginning of the stuff on measurables. Okay. So just to briefly review, I'll try to take no more than 5 or 10 minutes unless people have questions, which would be cool. V is going to be our absolute place. He refers to it both ways, right? Place in order to remind us that it is not a set. It is a proper class, which metaphorically we can think of as the place of sets, the place of the possibility of sets. Why? Because up to a certain point, at least in the development of science, we think of things as being in a place, but we don't think of a place as being in anything, except perhaps some larger place. If we have the largest place, we have, in a certain sense, anything, right? Everything. Recall, it's bounded only by contradiction, right? Which you can say means there's contradiction at the top, or you can say that there is no top, and perhaps that has some backward bending relation to the extension of a contradiction all the way at the very lowest level, which is the empty set. V has levels, right? The levels are indexed by ordinals. If anybody isn't clear on the difference between ordinals and cardinals, please speak now. So our ordinals are the spine up here. They form a proper class, just as V as a whole does, and they're right in the center. You can't have a model of V that doesn't include them. That would be deeply perverse. Basically, you would narrow V to the point where it has disappeared. Okay, so that level's indexed by ordinals. Everyone's okay with that. It has this beautiful structure of appearance and reappearance that Badu talks about, and that is a new, in this book, I think, way of talking about the difference between set and power set. Does everybody recall that? I wonder if I can find it quickly. Should be in that first passage, V, right? Formal exposition of the absolute place. Yes, page 61. This whole subsection, section 4, is really good. It's one of these expository masterpieces that Badu produces, where, rather like Plato, he's telling you something that at the level of facts you might think you already know, or at least acquire cleanly from this, but really the philosophical work is being done in so many subtle choices in the exposition, how you talk about this stuff. And it sets you up then for the more unfamiliar the less familiar, is how they claims at the center of the book about the absolute, in the same way that, that for instance, Socratic dialogues, because of the way they describe very ordinary things, set you up for something like the idea of good. And I want to ask you guys about your interpretations of the idea of the good. I'll probably give mine next time as compactly as possible. In fact, that shows up maybe for the first time at the top of 61 here. We haven't read this together yet, have we? Okay. First full sentence, the class V, I repeat, is not a set. It is not a form of being, but the place of thought, the thinking being place, where the formal being of possibility gathers in the guise of the possible forms of multiple being as such. That is, of what constitutes the form of being of an object in a particular world. I'm not sure whether this line is slightly more complicated than it needs to be. I wonder if it would suffice simply to say that being is not a being, theme that we're quite familiar with, right? This is supposedly the problem with autotheology. Being is not a being, and being isn't simply, perhaps as in transcendental philosophy, the form of each possible being, right? So, so being is not a cube, and it's not the transcendental possibility of a cube. It's the quasi-totality of all of those possibilities. Plato would say, I'll contest this next time, Plato would say that V is the idea of form of the multiple as such, and therefore the idea of the idea. Actually, yeah, I'm fully on board with that. Note that the idea of the good, which for him was indeed the idea of the ideas, was not for Plato an idea. Fully on board with that. Much in the same way that V, which contains the thought of all the possible forms of the pure multiple, is not itself such a form. And remember that syntactically we accomplish this just by saying that a set can be an element of V, but V can't be an element of anything. That's a purely syntactic solution for how it's possible to talk about the absolute without contradiction, right? Because we know that you call it the set of all sets would be a contradiction on pain of what's called Russell's paradox. Not Russell's, not a paradox. Zermelo found it. Cantor had already found it. It's just the theorem that there is no set of all sets on pain of contradiction. So one of the tasks we always have is to explain how talking about V is different from talking about you, even if we don't put it inside any larger entities. This is one way that we usually describe predication, right? V belongs to the class of things that have a certain property. So it looks like there's an initial problem saying anything about V, saying anything about the absolute. There are, I think, two answers, or rather a two-part answer to this that we're getting to in the central sections of the book, and they correlate with the twofold status of measurable cardinals as what mediates between truths and the absolute. But I don't want to get too far ahead. Those two aspects of the solution to how it's possible to talk about V, one of them has to do with height, one of them has to do with width. So remember, V has height that's measured by the ordinals. It also has width that's measured by cardinality at each level, right? And any initial segment, any place of chopping off the hierarchy of V is itself going to have a cardinality, both a height and a width. So with respect to height, we have the trick that we talked about last time. Badiou doesn't extensively thematize the reflection principle as such, but it's this idea that we can shoot at a characterization of the absolute and find that what we've described is already down on some level that is merely a set. And in a certain sense, that's a failure, but in a deeper sense, dialectical sense, I think, that's how these new forms in many cases are produced. Can you get all large cardinals by reflection principles? Probably not. The other half of the solution is width, right? When we're just thinking of a set of all sets, we don't make that distinction between height and width, but here we do, and the dialectical play between height and width is what's going to enable us to get started saying something about V, and at each step to continue having to say something else about V. A little more about that when I read the preview of the absolute here. But to finish out on page 61, we notice that each stage or each level is the power set of the previous one. Sorry for the tangent. There's one thing that I should say about levels if I haven't already. Please tell me if I've said this already, Daniel or anyone else. Have I mentioned that Badiou's definition of a level is slightly non-standard? Of rank, pardon me, is slightly non-standard.
It doesn't ring a bell to me. I don't
Okay.
think I heard you mention that before.
Okay. So we've got these levels, right? V up to the ordinal, up to and including the ordinal A, V up to and including the ordinal A+1. And the relation between those two, between a level and its successor, has this beautiful property, which is why I turned to page 61 to begin with. So down in the middle of the last full paragraph, I'd like to read the full paragraph actually. So using the language of ZFC symbolically to speak about V, right, to refer to V, to speak about something, to have a reference. And our task is going to be to show that you don't originally have necessarily a determinate referent right away, or at least not determinate enough. And so just as Hegel does in the POS, we're going to have to move from our initial confidence that we have the reference of our set theoretical speech all the way up to the absolute in which we do ostensibly have the referent. You might say the absolute referent is the referent for the first time that we unequivocally have something that we're talking about. To continue. So using the language of ZFC symbolically to speak about V, we assume that V is the union, in scare quotes, of all the levels V sub alpha, where alpha ranges over the sequence of ordinals, right? Thus, depending on the complexity of its construction, every set appears on a higher or lower level of the cumulative hierarchy. Cumulative hierarchy is just V itself regarded as stratified, right? In this sense, it appears, so to speak, before V as a whole, right? In a V sub alpha that is a set, that is merely a set, that is already a set before you arrive at the paradoxes of trying to speak directly about V, right? So this is one of the ways in which reflection style, the reference that you're trying to refer to gets reflected down, which is a bad thing in terms of the ascent of the absolute, but a good thing in terms of our ability to say things. It makes the work of the absolute manifest as a generative principle of form. Okay. Next line. The absolute place V can thus be thought not as the place where this or that set or of any kind appears, but as the place where everything that has already appeared at a level V sub alpha of the hierarchy reappears. So we have this idea of reappearance or repetition that I think should strongly recall, again, the phenomenology, right? In some way, things are done implicitly the first time and explicitly the second time. V thus brings together and combines the possible forms of multiple being, which as sets always appear first in a set. The absolute is not what makes the possible forms of being appear, but what preordains their general reappearance. It is a bit, I'm going out on a limb here, as if the absolute did not concern the birth of the forms of being, but only their resurrection, or as if there were an overall last judgment, quote, this is a possible form of being, that is not, without there ever having been any creation ex nihilo or any originary presence in the place of the absolute, namely the class V, defined as a union of all levels of the cumulative hierarchy corresponding to all the ordinals. We want to be careful, of course, not to think that V is only the second time that any set appears. Anytime a set appears, it appears at all of the levels above the level at which it first appears. So by the time you get to V, it might be the second philosophically interesting appearance, maybe, of a given set. But in fact, it's appeared a proper class of times, an absolutely infinite number of times by the time you get to the absolute. That's not what I'm saying is non-standard. That's just a clarification of the text. But look at the difference between a level where a set, look at the difference between two successor levels, right? So look at the difference between V alpha and V alpha plus 1. Not every level is a successor level, of course, right? We have limit levels. But look at the successor levels. On V alpha, there are a bunch of elements, right? There are also implicitly, so to speak, the subsets made out of those elements, which Badiou likes to call the parts, right? So at V alpha, there are explicitly the elements, and there are implicitly the parts. But those parts are not counted as elements yet, on pain of contradiction. That would make the power set equal to the set, right? It would squash the successor level into the level that we've already got, and essentially it would accordion down all of V into a single contradictory level. So what appears implicitly as a subset at V alpha appears explicitly as as an element at V alpha plus 1, and then keeps appearing at every level all the way up from there. That's why the hierarchy is a cumulative hierarchy, right? And this is perfectly valid. The only thing non-standard about it is what you want to call the rank of a set. Intuitively, you want to say that the rank of a set is alpha when X first appears at level V sub alpha, right? But there's an arbitrary terminological choice here. What do you mean by appears? You can mean where it appears implicitly as a subset, or you can mean where it appears explicitly as an element. Now, this is not a difficult, there's nothing mathematically difficult about here, right? Because this is the very next level. We're only going from V alpha to V alpha plus 1. It's the simplest possible movement in the hierarchy. But which of those are you going to call first appearing? Which of them are you going to call the rank of a set? Badiou, yeah. Badiou calls the rank of X where X first appears as an element. In literature, in Kanamori and Yek, and I presume in Kuhn is his third source, who I forgot to mention in the first session. Definitely in Kanamori and Yek, the terminological choice is made the other way. The rank of a set is considered to be the level at which it first appears as a subset or implicitly, where it's only a matter, I would try to say dialectically, of it being, but not of being known, not of being counted. And the only reason this is important, it doesn't introduce any problem with the book because it's consistent throughout the book. The only reason it's important is if you try to take some statements in isolation out of the book and put them together with other discourses in set theory, you'll run into a contradiction if you don't remember this difference. So it's an arbitrary terminological difference. This leads that due to the theorem that the rank of a set is always a successor level. And the easiest way, the way that he uses to make this intuitively clear is just to think about omega, right? Our first infinite set. Suppose that omega were the rank in this sense of any element. Well, then there would have to be an element that appeared for the first time on level omega. Well, what's that going to be? Can it be the element 42? No, because the element 42 appears at least by level 43, and then all the way up to omega, as it were, right? So it can't be the first time it appears. And the same thing is true for any finite number. It has to have appeared already omega times by the time you get to the limit. So it can't be any finite element that appears for the first time at level omega. And it can't be any infinite element that appears for the first time at level omega either, because the smallest infinite is omega itself, and that doesn't appear until its successor level. It doesn't appear as an element until its successor level, v omega plus 1. That makes sense so far? So that's a nice thing to be able to say. No limit stage is a rank. For proving most theorems, the reason that set theorists choose the opposite is that this also lets you say something nice, namely, the rank of any ordinal is itself. So if A is an ordinal, then the rank of A is the A, where it first appears implicitly. And that just makes your calculations with ordinals and ranks nicer. So now we want to start looking more closely at the height and width of V. Here's our limit ordinal that we were just talking about, V omega. There are plenty of others. We started to talk last time about inner models. So L, the constructible universe, is our smallest inner model. That's the boundary. Notice that the ordinals are well inside of that. V is the outer boundary. It's not an inner model of itself. It's not a squeezing together of itself, but there's room to squeeze in here. And up to a point from the inside of a theory, and this is a crucial distinction, up to a point from the inside of a theory, height and width look as though they're independent. So you can take the same statements, just taking phi as some generic statement, you can take the same statements and you can have them be true in both L and in the intended model V, without being able to tell the difference between them. They're like the truth teller and the liar when you ask which one is the truth teller. They both say they're the truth teller because they're telling the truth, and the liar because they're lying. That's rather what L's affirmation of the same sentences as V is like. From the outside, which is to say, if you're using resources that aren't available inside the model, you can already tell much earlier than a measurable cardinal that something has gone wonky. Just to give one, I think, rather particularly dramatic example, in L, viewed from the outside, every uncountable cardinal uncountable as we see it from the outside, thinking in terms of V, every uncountable cardinal is an inaccessible cardinal. We can put that in scare quotes and remind ourselves that that's what L calls them. We can see from the outside that they're just perfectly ordinary uncountable cardinals, but L calls them all inaccessible, which is to say they're all beyond the theory of ZFC as interpreted in L. Because inaccessibles are going to be our smallest large cardinals that we care about. Have I said everything about this so far? Pretty much. We've got the boundary of sets whose existence can be proven within just ZFC. And then we have inaccessibles. There's something in between called worldly cardinals, which I'm going to mention briefly wherever it's appropriate in the discussion of the inaccessibles. The inaccessibles are nice because they're models of ZFC, but they are not, strictly speaking, the smallest models of ZFC. These perverse little things called worldly cardinals are, and we'll explain why they're perverse in a moment. And then we have our compact cardinals, right? This is the threshold at which V can no longer equal L. And as we were talking about last time, when we squeeze to any inner model between V and L, we can tell from inside the theory that something has happened. There is some K that is a measurable cardinal that moves when we do that squeezing, which is called J. So K is the critical point of the function J, and we can tell that from the inside of a theory that knows about measurable cardinals. I think that's everything I've got in the diagram right now. Any comments about that? So the contrast that I was drawing just now is we can tell things about width and height very early on from the outside. Philosophically, we can tell that there's something wrong with L, but L can't tell that there's something wrong with L. Whereas a theory that admits a measurable cardinal, I don't know why, forgive me, it's a measurable cardinal. What Badiou calls a complete cardinal, that is the critical point, etc. I was just going up and I forgot to write measurable. So we can tell from the outside, but a theory that admits a measurable cardinal can tell from the inside that it can't be describing L. That it can't be describing L under the name of V. That it can't be accidentally describing L. All right. Any remarks about that?
If you'll indulge me, I'd like to go to 254 in the text.
Mm-hmm.
And this, he gives little 4 points here where he talks about his 4 concepts of the infinity, which were derived from divine infinity of years past, where it was God who was the infinite. And these were the ways in which God was infinite, was that he was transcendent, he was resistance to divisions, or his immanence, or his proximity to the absolute kind of thing. And
forgive me for interrupting for just 1 second. That can't be true. That can't be true, right? It cannot be the case that they are that anybody could really have looked at the theology and then derived rationalized forms of large cardinals. It has to be in retrospect. We take these large cardinals and we're like, oh, that reminds us of certain theological precedents. If only because there are plenty of other theological precedents that aren't included. But I apologize. Please go on.
Yeah, I would figure maybe this is an okay jumping off point to talk about the different types of infinity that Badiou is introducing and using. And you mentioned a second ago the idea of a complete cardinal. And my
Yes.
question just intuitively was, is a complete cardinal the understanding of those four types of infinities that he has formalized in absence of God, that it shares those four qualities, and that's a complete cardinal?
In a way, yes. And I think he likes this property, and I think that's why he calls it complete. I can't follow him there because talking about completeness is dangerous if we don't mean completeness in the literal sense. And because if you remember that it's a measurable cardinal, you remember one half of what it does. And then you only have to remember that it's the critical point of an elementary embedding. But yes, you're exactly right. So we've got our four kinds in an ascending hierarchy. Of course, we have the ordinary cardinals of ZFC, then we've got inaccessibles, compacts, measurables, complete. And there's no one good name for this. We can call them large cardinals. They're the ones that are produced by elementary embeddings, by squeezing V into a slightly tighter place. But that's the name of a technique. That's not the name of a large cardinal. So I'll put it in parentheses here, inner models. Or we can just speak of large cardinals. Compacts and inaccessibles are small large cardinals. Measurables are the threshold traditionally, because we call small anything that's compatible with V equals L and large anything that isn't compatible with V equals L. Now, implication flows downward. So exactly as you say, any measurable cardinal is compact, any measurable cardinal is inaccessible, any compact is inaccessible, except for one or two places where there are branches because things aren't known yet. The entire large cardinal hierarchy works that way. So it's not really a special property in any way of measurables. It's just the nature of this linear hierarchy, this hierarchy that has been discovered to be linear, that was not planned to be linear. We got these concepts from all over the place, that each one at a higher level synthesizes all of the ones below. But what makes it such a beautiful nexus for Badiou is that in addition to doing that, it's kind of the first instance that also needs to be understood in terms of this higher function of being the critical point of an inner model. So really what we mean here is large cardinals that are larger than measurables. But this is the first one where you really, where that technique, the technique of inner models, is really necessarily brought into it. If that makes sense, it segues really nicely into the two functions of a measurable cardinal in relation to the absolute. But do you want to come back with anything before we go there?
Just the payoff here is this is where the point where V cannot equal L.
Yeah. Yep, that's the threshold between small large cardinals and large cardinals. Forgive the Starbucks, I forgot my coffee and it's what they had in the library. All right. Here's preview of the absolute. I think it's from an absolutely gorgeous chapter, C17. And my notes start going crazy somewhere around page 362, and they just get more and more ecstatic as we go. Because this is where, at least as far as I noticed, we first have relatively detailed discussion about what the absolute is doing in relation to truths. And this goes back to, I think, remarks of Chris's from maybe last time or some previous session, precisely about that, about the relation between truths in their exceptional status and the absolute. Here, I think, is where we really start to see how that works. I'm not sure that we even knew before this. We might have. I might have just forgotten it. I'm not sure we even knew before this that the work of the absolute is to absolutize truths. Did we know that before? Okay. So how do you absolutize truths, right? You've got truths, you've got the absolute. There has to be some mediation between them. So here's where we start getting the form of the mediation. Reading semi-randomly the first full paragraph of 362. What the ontological treatment of this point will clarify is that what is creative is precisely the difference between S and J of S. Of course, the properties of J of S are those of S, provided that we are operating by concentration on a cardinal K that is infinite enough to support ultrafilters with powerful properties. I want us to go back, of course, and do all of that filtering and ultrafiltering stuff, but this is intended to motivate. But if J of S should happen to be identical to S, what he means is if an inner model should happen to be identical to what it is a model of, to what it's modeling, regardless of what S is, the absolutization of a truth by the attribute M will fail, because the class that is its place is nothing but an illegible, worthless copy of the absolute, and not the wholly new operator, certainly immanent to the absolute V with respect to its main properties, but which is nevertheless effective only to the extent that it differs locally from it. The test of the creation of the classes of absolutization is precisely this double movement of the absolute. This double function of measurable cardinals is, I think, the absolute center of the book. It's double movement whereby they, and it's via the measurable cardinal that the elementary embeddings can do this, they testify to the absolute at the point of truth where it was lacking, while leaving on truths, even when they have received the touch of the absolute, the ephemeral mark of their former non-existence. Actually, that's not the double function yet. Please go to the next page, 363, for the double function. Second full paragraph. For the time being, let's just say that we ideally have a possible situation of connection between truth and absoluteness. This is going to be literal, connection between the kinds of truths that we had in being an event and the absolute V, encapsulated in 3, which seems like 4 points. 1, M, the inner model, being the attribute of the absolute referent in which a truth occurs, is a transitive subclass of V, global immanence. We'll get to what that means shortly. M validates the same statements as V. That was our phi that was moving back and forth between V itself and an inner model. Same statements. An immanent modeling of V by M, a miniature model expression or participation effect, right? He claims that we're able to do Hegel and Spinoza equivalently here. That participation and sharing in an attribute of the absolute are essentially the same property. Platonic participation and Spinozistic expression of an attribute of the absolute are essentially the same property, or that at least this scheme is going to provide a way to synthesize them. It's a remarkable claim, obviously. 3, there exists a relation J called an elementary embedding of V into M, such that if X has such and such property in V, J of X has the same property in M. Now phi is moving up instead of just in. The global immanent modeling is locally attested by the J relation. There is a localization of the space of absolutization of truth. It is not absolutely, but it operates absolutely. 4. However, J is not identity. There exists at least one set S of V such that J of S is not S. This is our critical point, measurable cardinal. There is thus, via the attributes, the transitive classes that are inner models of V, a differentiating capacity in their immanence to the absolute. Go down to the partial paragraph, if you would, at the end of this page. After the colon. No, sentence. What is involved is no less than the following point. If there are truths and not truth, it is because the absoluteness of a truth does not mean that a truth is the absolute. Okay. So, as I see it, but let Bedu continue speaking for a moment. The bold and italic paragraph, surely we should read. The theorem then takes its definitive and profound philosophical form. Quote, well, it's all a quote. The existence of an explicit relation from the absolute to one of its attributes, which is to say the participation, both local and global, of a truth constructed in a world in its own absoluteness, takes on the meaning for human animals of an orientation of their lives only if it is not the sterile identity of the absolute with itself, if therefore it includes the difference between what is absolutely, the absolute referent which exists, and what in a world binds a life to an absolute value, namely a singular truth. Okay, so we're starting to see that the mediator has two criteria to fulfill. It has to connect us to the absolute, but it has to bear witness to its own difference from the absolute. The measurable cardinal is what bears the work of testifying to its own difference from the absolute. Because when you take what shares in the absolute, that property of the absolute, the inner model M, that mediates you with the absolute. But it can't be confused with the absolute because of the witness, the measurable cardinal K. K moves. So facetiously in something I sent out on Zulib, I said measurable cardinals are John the Baptist. In particularly the Gospel of John, they make a really big deal, not the same John, obviously. They make a really big deal that the testimony of John the Baptist is that the light, Jesus, whatever, the Logos, exists, and that he, John, is not the light, right? So it has to do both jobs. It has to testify to the existence of the absolute, and it has to testify that it itself is not the absolute. As a change of width in V to mediate truths with the absolute, it allows an authentic attribute of the absolute to be participated in. As height, the movement of the measurable cardinal, K, it testifies to its difference from the absolute. Those are the two functions of the mediation of a measurable cardinal / elementary embedding between truths and the absolute. the positive mediating function, the negative mediating function, and we want them to have a relation of necessity, those two functions between each other, which they do. That's the point of Scott's theorem, which I want to give a proof of next time if we can. That's simply the theorem that says that if you have this elementary embedding, the measurable cardinal moves. So
can I ask a question?
please.
Does the measurable cardinal refer to the work of what Badiou calls the militant subject? So if John the Baptist is not like the absolute, but is kind of modeling it, so to speak, that's what the work of militant subjectivity is about, because it's precisely not of a relation, as he says here, of a sterile identity of the absolute with itself. It's something separate from that. And then the finitude of the human animal, the closest you get would be the militant subjects. Is that correct?
That sounds right to me. I can't think of an objection right now.
Sorry?
I can't think of an objection right now. Does anybody else have one? Of course, when we're dealing with these metaphors, right, I just personified a measurable cardinal, right? You shouldn't do that. We have things that can be personified operating in this story, and they're not the large cardinals themselves. They're subjects, as Daniel just said, right? They're militant subjects. So that's the limit of any personifying metaphor for a large cardinal.
So I'll throw this as a reference to 79 in the book, when he's talking about oppression by division of the infinite. And separating. It's the very bottom of the paragraph above section 3. I'm starting at the oppression here consists less in dividing, even though that is required, than in separating. As a result, infinite resistance consists in preventing such separation. The objective is to ensure that the cell's core groups and basic meetings that are separated from the others by being relegated to one part of the partition are nevertheless made up of individuals who, if gathered all together, would form a compact set whose infinity is commensurate with the situation. There will thus be an organized relocation of one subset of the situation that, in a sense, thanks to its own infinity, is equivalent to the whole situation. So this, going off of what your question was, as far as are there militants that are based around this sort of notion of an infinity, is that if you divide a movement up into as many individuals as possible, can they reconstitute themselves? Do they carry some sense of the infinite with them as a militant subject? Would be what I'm reading out of that. If that makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. But then you couldn't necessarily describe that operation in the examples used in different musical or art compositions per se. So there's some more thinking there, but I think that it does work that the operator would qualify in that way. Because one of the things I'm trying to do, John, and that I'd like to do maybe next session, if we could, is try for those of us that are on less mathematical Badiousians, try to fit, maybe even we could say, a vocabulary of connection back to of metaphor, not in a vulgar way, but back to some of these categories that you're helping us elucidate. Because I think the more that we do that, at least for some of us, I think it might help strengthen our application of how these different levels work, if that makes sense.
Yes, indeed. And one of the characteristics of this book is that those applications are scattered. They're embedded often in the discussion of the ontology, at least in the essential books. So I hope people are starting to keep a list of what's said about art at each stage ontologically, what's said about love at each stage ontologically. I'm keeping it, but it's nowhere near ready for prime time yet.
Yeah, I think it sounds good. and there are some absolutely beautiful examples. I was really struck by, in the section on the various types of finitude, the role of both detritus, or like the I think he even uses this in a Lacanian sense of like the object A, that kind of like excess, which is of nil, or even kind of like waste, the waste excess. And he uses, I forget the exact page number, I can find it in a moment. He uses Lacan's famous example from Littérature, one of his famous, most difficult seminars, of Freud's importance of human waste and shit as the kind of bedrock of civilization. And I was curious how, John, you might think about this theory of the waste product, and how it might actually fit on some of the graphs and diagrams that you've already concocted. When you encountered that section, how were you theorizing that discussion there, out of curiosity? I know it might slightly tangential, I apologize, but maybe it could connect.
No, I'd like to hear you talk about it more. The crux of the matter is in the transition between waste product and work, right? And that we need to get when everyone has read sections 6 and 7, I think, especially 7, where we start talking about the index of absoluteness of a work. So I'm slightly reluctant to try to anticipate. I don't feel like I've worked it through well enough to anticipate, but if anyone else has, including you, by all means.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's connected to the refuse, which is in a way connected to the generic, but is also that strange object of Beju, which cannot be converted into like seriality. It's kind of like that which escapes the laws of finitude, and it's also something, a site of emancipation, I feel, as well. So I will let me look for the passage. You continue, and we can raise that at a later point. I need to find it though.
Actually, I've always promised that we'll take a break in the middle, and I've always violated that promise. So what if we take 10, you can look for it, and so when we come back, we can also try the experiment of reading C12 and C13 together, just sticking to the text to the extent that people are interested in doing so. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Great.
All right, back in 10.
10 minutes? Okay, cool. Sounds good, everybody. So that's 10 after, it's the top of the hour, so 10 after.
Yeah. Daniel, did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah. Well, I just think we should reference, I mean, part of the interesting thing from Logics of Worlds to this text is the elaboration of the thesis of what's called democratic materialism. Democratic materialism is based on the kind of syllogistic logic that is the reigning ideology of our world, of kind of late capitalism, or whatever you want to call it. There's many different names you can give to it, but it is treated in Immanence of Truths in a different way. And I just want to draw your attention to the 4 types of finitude, which he pinpoints new kind of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which include economism, biologism, historicism, and relativism. And these are treated from pages basically 88 up to 98, as each producing a distinct type of waste product. And in an interesting way, he makes a series of references, obviously, to that humanity is the product of these various procedures. And so my question was, and then of course each one falls into a different typology of the finite, the accessible, the divisible, the bounded, or the one of denial. So again, there are 4, and I think you could map those 4 onto the reactive, the obscure, the resurrection, and the militant. Perhaps that's a possibility we could elaborate. But yeah, what I wanted to note here is maybe connecting this in a more practical way to what John was elucidating before, is precisely what form of the finite, or rather, what form of large cardinality, how is waste management treated? What's the sewer system of large cardinality? That's my question. I know that's a huge question, but perhaps you might be able to improvise some thoughts on that, perhaps. And again, it's a psychoanalytic point to reference this repetition of waste as a motif. There's many points there that link to Lacan, and I think he does actually make a reference to Lacan as well. So, any thoughts on that?
While I'm vamping, when you said syllogistic logic of the world, you meant the constructible logic of the world, right?
Oh, sorry. It's just that no, it's based on
There are bodies and language except there are truths.
There are bodies and language except there are truths. That's what I meant by syllogistic. So I think that actually is a syllogism, right, Chris? I mean, in a classical sense, in a basic sense, it is a syllogism.
To say that there are bodies and language, yeah, or only bodies and language. But
Yeah, the exception, yeah, of course, then the exception is the scandal, the outlaw, the that which, but yeah, then that is I guess my question is, how is waste management dealt with by V?
Sure. We don't have to clarify the syllogism right now. It's something so weak that it doesn't even appear here. As an experiment, since you pointed us here, what if we read A, the accessible finite, and then abut it directly to C12? So it's very clear, at least, that these first two, right, the accessible finite and the divisible finite, are going to be cured for us, right, by inaccessible cardinals and compact cardinals, which are supposed to resist division from the outside. It would be nice to be able to see the bounded finite and the finite by way of denial of all absoluteness as mapping onto measurables and large cardinals.
You don't know that they do?
I think I'm missing something in seeing how they do, but the first two are very clear. So what if we do the accessible finite first, and then try to see how inaccessibility responds to that?
Okay, let me read it very quickly then. The accessible finite is everything, this is 89, is everything constituted at every moment by the operations that are available in a situation, without anything supplementing this availability having to be invented or created. And the clearest example is the market. If the operations available in this situation are considered to be those that make an acquisition in the broadest sense of the term possible, in essence, those that make things accessible on the market, then the constituent operations are buying and selling. It immediately becomes clear that what the things, quote, dealt in or exposed in this way have in common is precisely that any one thing is equivalent to any other thing on the market, in that it has become, like any other one, accessible. However, the accessibility of the thing, which can obviously just as easily be a stock, an intangible asset, as a material object or an industrial company, is regulated by a limit external to the thing, a limit or measure that comes from an infinite virtuality, itself inaccessible as a totality, will have recognized in such a limit the price of the thing exposed on the market and in what the price is based on. We recognize money as the general equivalent, Money is the confirmation in the context of the inaccessible infinity of the thing's accessibility on the market. The thing becomes accessible as long as it has a price, and as long as it has a price that that price indicates its finitude as virtual accessibility. What is inaccessible in this regard is capital as such, that is, capital as the overall master of this type of setup. Money is not capital, it is merely the reflection of the capitalist exposure of things on the market. So I think that all is clear, and then it just goes on, the subjectivity that goes with this type of finitude is a consumerist subjectivity. And the general ideology of this finitude by way of accessibility can be called economism, or what Pasolini called humble corruption. Economism is the imperative that requires us to remain within the finite circle of accessibility in the name of an inaccessibility by way of transcendence that no one can invoke. It is a passive finitude that is not even able to conceive what it is the waste product of, even though the slightest monetary transaction is a waste product of capital, a passive execution of its transcendental circulation. All right, so that is the accessible finite, and that is economism, or the market. And then he says, and the divisible finite is, and he uses in a very interesting way the example of the movement of the squares politically, which resonates with many of us. And he says the divisible finite is finitude by way of divisibility that takes hold whenever a movement is unable to maintain its own unity, to remain faithful to itself. This subjectivity is typical of the statement, the situation is not ripe, we'd better give up. So the problem here is, again, that this form of finitude gives into the problem of what he calls realism. It gives up.
The first one is passive from the beginning and all the way through. The second relapses into passivity, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a movement that formulates the general principle of its constitutive affirmation that develops with a compact infinity that creates a work and is not satisfied with just the passive negation of what there is. It can stand up to reality as in a lasting way, such as the slogan of the Egyptians when they said for Mubarak to get out, or the slogan defeat Macron. Beju says this is not enough. To be sure, you are becoming part of a mass protest. You are declaring your refusal to be a mere waste product. Again, that connects back to the subjectivity of democratic materialism, which is the accessible finite. So actually, I think the answer would be the subject of democratic materialism could appear in all of these, I suppose, but especially in the in accessible finite. And again, that motif of waste product returns. And it's interesting that the gesture of affirmation is one of a refusal to submit to that status of being a waste product. And it's also a very common motif in contemporary French thought to, from a Marxist, post-Marxist standpoint, to theorize a proletariat as a kind of universal proletariat, kind of proletarianization, because proletariat is detritus, is waste, is that those who are discarded, et cetera, right? So I like that point as well. And so he says, so realism, in essence, the principle that it is the dominant order that determines what is possible, takes its revenge within you. And here again, of course, we have the motif of betrayal to fidelity. When it eats away from within, at the uprisings of life, when they are experiencing the first symptoms of fatigue, realism leaves the way open to renunciation and betrayal. Ultimately, when you look at things closely, nearly everyone betrays out of realism. Even the people who were horrible traitors during the last World War thought the Germans were settled in for a long time. The Pétain had limited the damage. So again, he's not using his usual reference, which is to his own comrades of May 68, but he's going back to his father's generation to discuss this. And then we have C, the bounded infinite. And this is.
Before you go there, it's just such a great line. The penultimate here: the traitor is an avant-garde realist.
Yeah, that is incredible, isn't it? Yeah, Yeah, I underlined that when I read that. It was very striking, wasn't it? I mean, he's making that on 2 points. One is literally there were bourgeois artists who politically sold out the movement, the cause. But I think he's also saying something about how it's a reference actually to socialist realism in a certain sense, I think. Yeah, for sure. Because that was what the avant-garde was interested in at that time, in some sense, you see? So I think there's something there, actually.
And
Right.
it also, just in a literal flat-footed way, surely the trader is an avant-garde realist in that their realism causes them to give up in advance of failure, right?
Yep.
The movement hasn't even failed yet.
Right.
You're really out in front with respect to failure. You're an innovator of failure.
Exactly. Yeah. So the bounded, sorry, go ahead, jump in.
Sorry, just one really quick thing to underline on the bottom of 90, and this goes to the point of democratic materialism. So when we're talking about bodies and language, we can think of the bodies that occupied the here square. The language was Mubarak, get out now, but that there was no exception in that sense of truth. And he sort of highlights that when he says, but without a sound frame of reference of the compact infinity type, you are not constructing a work, in this case, a politics. So the simple demand of Mubarak, get out now was effectively met, but then they didn't know what to do after that, right? The Muslim Brotherhood took over, the military took over, and there was no real perseverance of any type of communist idea. He lays that out really well in Rebirth of History, when he talks about this idea that there was not an idea, that we're still in this sort of interbolic period between the last, major political event of 68 until we get the next major political event. So the exception was not there for Egypt. Same thing with Occupy, arguably with Black Lives Matter, and any other sort of hitherto uprising that we've seen in the past few decades, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's true. Beju says that the uprisings laid the site. They were laying what in being in event part 1 terminology would be called like the laying of the site, but the common slogans of the masses in revolt did not accelerate or move to a sequence of what he calls the historical riot, because I think that the slogans themselves did not circulate a reference which would be to the inaccessible dimension of the struggle. So they were kind of aborted movements that succumbed ultimately to the divisible finite, is one way to think about them, I think. And then of course we have the bounded finite, which is the insidiousness of particularity and the sophism of identity, which he says can be defined very broadly as the refuge sought enclosed identities, where the general space lends itself as a complete infinity to the expansion of huge subsets. The subjectivity at work is essentially identitarian, but also exclusive. Indeed, more than identity itself, which is always elusive and evanescent, it is the rejection of what is not identity that gives it its real. So it's interesting here on a couple levels. One is he's talking about contemporary identity politics, but he's using the example of Nazism. So you worry immediately there that politically he's falling into a kind of French ultra-leftism in some sense, right? Wait a second, is all identity politics like this? I don't, there's one could read that. But then he goes further. The third paragraph, he says the ideology of this type of finitude consists of everything that presents itself in support of close, so he gives examples, biological racism, but also the sense of cultural, material, and historical superiority, which is very prevalent in the West, the various forms of religious sectarianism, nationalism of all kinds, historicism. And again, historicism is not like what Frederick Jameson is doing, but historicism is basically different than that. It's like like a good example for him would be laïcité in the French civic republic, right? Or like any kind of liberal nationalistic enchantment project, right? Today, almost all propaganda, even the supposedly progressive or left-wing type, draws its raw material from this stockpile. That's because we're living in times when communism is very weak. The only global universality is the complicity between the world market and finance. But no one, apart from very exclusive oligarchy, can take personal pride in the miracles of the market and the bliss of being a billionaire. Thus, ideologized finitude, and therefore subjective slavery, can only be constituted on an identitarian basis. That is the secret behind the seemingly paradoxical coexistence of a globalized capitalism and a local consolidation across the globe. So I guess you could say then there's a strong interaction between A and C, the accessible and the bounded, right? That's important to note there. And then finally, we have—
Before you go on, can I point out one thing? You put your finger on the point of translation to our third infinity. I just read straight past it, but it's right there at the beginning of the second paragraph of C. The contrast, closed identities as opposed to what, right? We might expect him to be talking directly about the generic there, right, as true universality. But here we have a new association with what resists closed identity. It's the existence of huge subsets. And that's going to be our way into ultra filters. And so you found the place that correlates C, the bounded finite, with its rejection by a measurable cardinal, even if that's not what you intended to do. You have found it.
That's helpful, yeah. But then the problem is then he negates that by saying that the world does not possess access point, whereas it did. And that access point was communism, or really existing socialism, as a kind of, as a site over there in which a constructible infinity in the Western world could be constructed as an alternative to A, if that makes sense. So doesn't he also close that down in a sense? Because it's kind of like, if we are these subjects of democratic materialism without the specter of a communist universalism of the large subset itself, where would it come from? Where does that make sense? I know that's a strange question. It's very political.
I may be missing the point. I'm not sure that we disagree, right? So the correlation we were trying to make is between these forms of finitude and the large cardinals that are going to reject these forms of finitude, right? So even if within this world that we've got, we don't see access to what is analogous to a measurable cardinal, well, that's precisely the problem with the world that we've got. And
exactly.
In order to see the hinge, in order to find the thread that will lead us in there, we're going to have to look at later sections, I think.
Yeah. All right. That's
does that suffice to explain that we don't disagree?
No. It does. I guess that's the question of thinking Beju very politically. Can be a frustrating exercise precisely because it becomes a question of the location imminent to the world, and this is actually why Beju develops what he calls subtractive politics, because you don't need subtractive politics in the prior period where the communist idea had a presence in the world, which is why when he creates Can Politics Be Thought, it happens at a very specific historical moment of the absence of communism. So strategically, everything politically has to change. Okay, so let's talk about D, which is very—
one really quick observation on this discussion is that even when we talk about historicism, that still applies to the Soviet Union and this overemphasis on what is proletariat and what is not proletariat, and the transition from, say, the politics of Stalinism to the politics of Maoism. where Maoism is based more on the idea that there is a correct handling of contradictions among the people, among the masses, and that it's based on these sort of generic solutions that apply to everyone, as opposed to just eliminating what is not proletariat and constructing a society based around that. Even though proletariat, in a sense, isn't strictly speaking a biological identity, as to say one being Jewish and Nazism trying to eradicate, but the sort of very, very thin line, as I think Marcuse put it to Heidegger, of civilization and barbarism. So I would.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, Béju's relationship to Stalinism within France is very interesting, because also, in a sense, Stalinism can quite easily be categorized in the bounded finite, very, very easily. There's nothing of the communist idea in Stalinism. You're right. In other words, the late USSR is not necessarily the sort of progenitor or the sort of production point of that possibility. I think it's something else which we can talk about. But okay, let's talk about D, denial. So you could actually probably assign, in a Béjuian sense, little virtues to these ones, but that's something we could think about later. The infinity by way of proximity to the absolute, which we'll consider at length in section 10, can be defined here in terms of the actual existence of a variety of works classically known as truths, which assume in their origin a real capacity for approximation of the absolute, directed against all relativisms. In the order of being, the existence of a higher infinity testifies precisely to the deployment of one of these approximations. The finite waste product of this type of higher infinity is therefore anything that denies not only the existence, but the possibility of existence of an approximation of the absolute. This position, the denial of truths and of the type of infinity that testifies to them, has produced numerous arguments of justification, from the great skepticism of antiquity to its abject form, contemporary relativism. So this is Socrates in the Agora fighting the sophists, right? Who are ultimately against his form of subjectivity, as I read it. This is like found there. Where does it appear today? He says the simplest example is the democracy of opinion, dominant throughout the West, which is based on the idea that in politics, there is no truth, that is, no real figure of an approximation of the absolute, nor is there any infinite witness to such an approximation. There's only opinions, and all opinions are equal, except for those like communism that explicitly deny that an egalitarian society could be founded on the absence of truth and the equivalence of difference, or even opposing opinions. The problem then, when you propagate relativism, is which rule can be used to mediate among the disparate opinions. The convenient solution, and the one that's prevailed, is to provisionally treat the opinion shared by the greatest number as correct. So this leads to the kind of common practice which is found in opinion polling, and therefore what they make is an absolutism out of relativism, right? So everyone's clear on that.
Which is why in the context of Plato-Socrates, there's always a subtle back channel communication between the traditionalists and the sophists, both of whom Plato-Socrates opposes. Please go on.
Yeah, that's right. So in this sense, we have a de-absolutized politics. We have basically the fact that there are only opinions in the political sphere, and that there is only the imagistic performance of one's body in the subjective sphere. This is actually why, when you say the political sphere, I think, and it goes back to Béju's subtractive politics, which is you have to have a subtractive politics to get out of the accessible finitude of the market, but also to create a subjective body of political actors who would be capable of thinking a new form of being together, of political life, that would not be submitted to the denial of all absoluteness, right? And because there's such a hegemonic incrustation of these logics, politics has to be founded on something completely different. Anyways, I'm a political Bajousian, so I apologize for that specificity. But and then he repeats his arguments here, and he develops in this too the dialectic.
But before you go there,
Go
can I
ahead.
ask you two
Yeah.
political questions?
Sure.
This is great. So my questions are going to be entirely
Sure.
naive, and if they seem like they require you to answer too much about your own views, then exegetically, then of course you can
Oh, sure. Sure.
either expand on those or put them aside as well.
Sure.
So the first one is back at accessibility. It looks like the situation we're in is that what the capitalists say, at least when they're talking to us and not talking to each other, is that there's no such thing as capitalism, because there's no such thing as a system of capital, right? They say that they're just doing the same thing all of the little actors do, just at a quantitatively larger scale. And that's the way in which the existence of capital is inaccessible or invisible within capitalist ideology, right? Capitalist ideology is to say there is no capitalism, just as like Thatcher's social theory is to say there is no society. My examples are terribly out of date, obviously. My question to you was going to be, how do we best see that capital and capitalism exist, either in reality or, say, in the text of Capital? What's the point at which we realize, there is a system, there isn't only a multiplicity of transactions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose this is what he refers to as the localization of the infinite, and for which I think within A, or at least in the example A that he develops that we just articulated a moment ago, of the accessible finite, to me, that's actually a great question. I guess the question you're asking is sort of, it actually requires that we think the dialectical relationship between the four. And he shows, I think in a nice way, examples in which there have been historical breaks from, say, D, relativism, or political breaks. I think actually one answer could be that in politics, it is possible to eradicate the bounded finite, the obsession with particularity, and that there actually have been, and that's through what you call the creation of the militant subject, the creation of like a kind of political organization. That's a whole thing we could discuss, which we've actually discussed in prior sessions with Tupanamba at different points. But I'm not sure exactly, because all of these are very new categories for me in thinking Bajou, so I don't have a clear grasp on how to think them dialectically yet. But I think
something on,
perhaps,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's something on 94 that's relevant to this, but the reason I put the question to you is that I can't tell whether this is an explanation or whether it's just saying that it happens. So down in B, the example of the global market, again, we have that capital in its systemic dimension is an inaccessible infinity, right? The job of communism, well, it can be finitized. Capital can be finitized in relation to a new political force, right, which is communism between 1848 and, say, 1976. Okay. So So then down at the bottom of that paragraph, the result is that economic activities themselves will be able to be conceived of as a simple result whose actual source, we can probably read cause, I don't know, in contrast to the anonymous infinity of capital will have been the emergence of the properly political force of communism. So I see that that speaks to the problem of how capital becomes finitized. Maybe I'm looking for a cognitive moment that isn't there. Maybe it just becomes finitized by the fact of revolution itself. I'm looking for this moment where we realize that capital or capitalism exists, and on that basis have something to resist. Does that moment exist in Badiou or in Marx?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, in other words, is there a kind of moment of consciousness of the inaccessibility of capital, which he says is concealed in the operation of the global market? And
I can imagine that maybe it happens in crises of the market, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, well, of course it does. No, of course. But I think that the point is not so much one of subjects reaching a kind of visibility or sort of the logic of the operation becoming visible in all of its inegalitarian brutality. I think that's not necessarily a formula that Badiou is going to follow, in the sense that it's too crisis theory driven, I would argue, in the sense that like an economic crash will somehow elevate the class consciousness of the proletariat. That's actually not, that's not the position of Marx.
There's passages in the book Happiness where he explicitly denies the idea that a crisis is something new in capitalism. It's actually a continuous repetition, and that there's never like an event in capitalism itself that's going to lead to its own downfall. It always has to come from a political outside.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Yeah, the immanence of the circulation of exchange values, and there's he uses a really nice term from Sartre called seriality, I think is a better way to understand the operation of how that finitude actually operates on subjectivity, which happens up like in like page 125. We don't have to go to that now. But anyways, long story short, I don't want to interrupt your plan, John, but I think this has been helpful to kind of throw these four down. We haven't quite yet talked about their dialectical relation, but we could. But I want to pause and just make sure we're not derailing things too much.
No, not at all. And that last part was really helpful to me. I just learned things. Thanks, Chris and Daniel. So I guess my problem there is that I wanted something too cognitive in relation to militancy, but probably I also embarrassingly momentarily forgot that we can only see these structures that are in a sense bad in relation to having posited a positive idea of the good or the true. It's an embarrassing thing for a Platonist to forget.
I would recommend Dennis Yao and Gabriel Tupanamba have a nice manuscript, which is pretty much completed. It's not yet published, on Badiou and political economy, where they look at this question of the appearance of the value form of capital and how that actually works for Badiou, kind of taking logics of worlds categories and really expanding them. If you send me an email, I could have it forwarded to anyone that wanted to look at it.
I'd also just interject here that this is a common criticism of Badiou from a lot of people, I think Sloboda Žižek especially, is that Badiou doesn't have a concept of political economy. So how can he possibly understand capitalism and the systems he's purporting to want to overthrow? I think he does actually have an understanding of capitalism throughout his work. It's especially thought out here in terms of just being a finite repetition of buying and selling in exchange and whatever. And whatever's offered by the market, and that the ultimate end, what you ultimately end up with is a waste product of what he refers to later as the worker consumer. And that's what the dominant ideology is prescribing to us, and that what we get out of it is just this finitude. And we should strive for something more vis-a-vis politics.
I'm just going to throw this out there without elaborating on it until we actually get to inaccessibles. But capital here reminds me of the smallest inaccessible cardinal. The reason being that V up to the level of smallest inaccessible cardinal is a model, like, allow me to pose it as a puzzle, obnoxiously. That's a model of what? Of what is that a model? V up to the level of the first inaccessible. What theory is that a model of? What statement is that a model of?
I think you've stumped us.
Okay, so by way of contrast, is that a model of ZFC plus the statement there exists an inaccessible cardinal? I want to erase this, so I'm just going to read it quickly. I think the 3 or 3.5 questions that we need to ask about each of these large cardinals, what are they? Why should we believe they exist? And then what do they model? A for ontology, B for the truth procedures. So that's pretty obvious. I'm just going to erase it. So consider V up to the level K, where K is the first inaccessible cardinal. Okay, that's a model of something, which is, in particular, it's a model of ZFC, which is one reason, that's one grain of sand on the side of why we should believe it, because it would be nice for there to be models of ZFC. Okay, so we can say VK is a model of, or makes true, ZFC. But it does a little more than that. V sub K is a good model of ZFC plus the statement, there does not exist an inaccessible cardinal. Why? Because the model is essentially the universe that the theory is working inside, right? That universe is, in this case, an inaccessible cardinal, but it knows not what it is. It doesn't know what it is. It knows its inhabitants. It knows its elements, right? So knowledge, it's one of the ways in which at this threshold between the appearance and the reappearance of something, which is so beautiful and dialectically rich here, I think, we see a being whose knowledge has not caught up with itself. And really, in a way, in V, at any stage of V, knowledge never catches up with being, so that we have to start referring to V as a quasi-totality in order to have that Parmenidean moment where being and thought can be brought into synthesis. But the more important point right now is that at a given level, being and knowledge are always misaligned. And the being of that level exceeds the knowledge at that level. And here, in an extremely dramatic way, inaccessibles are our first large cardinals that we care about. So if the universe consists of one, the smallest inaccessible cardinal, then within it, the theory that lives there thinks there are none. exactly analogously, if the universe were down at V omega is an excellent model of a theory that includes the statement, there are no infinite sets. Why? Because its inhabitants are the finite sets. And those are what it can know about. Self-knowledge, as much here as in the Charmides, is deeply aphoretic. Oh, right, the reason this reminds me of capital, if we think of capital as being something like the first inaccessible cardinal, then its being is such as to cover over knowledge of its being, right? So if we just...
Sorry.
No, please.
But one thing that's helpful about your question that I just remembered, an anecdote from Bedju that I think might help things here. One thing I asked him once in person after he gave a talk once, I was confused about something that he was saying as regards to the protests against capitalism in May 68. And he said, it's very important to understand that there was no crisis of capitalism in May 68. And that this is why that Jew is accused of being what's called a voluntarist. And okay, really close readers of Bedju will reject the notion that he's a voluntarist, but you can see immediately if you're a political theorist and you look at that statement, this goes back to what Chris was saying about his apparent lack of political attention to political economy. What he's saying is that, and partially for historical reasons as well, because we're not in the 19th century proletariat. So he says proletarian agitation, like that refusal to be the detritus, that refusal to be the waste product, comes through subtractive militant organization. It doesn't come through spontaneous reactions to the crises of capitalism, like a recession or a depression or anything like that, or even imperialism per se. So that is a position which kind of goes against some interpreters of Marx as well, just as background. So it's kind of an interesting question to ask, John, because it's something that Bedju is actually accused of not thinking adequately. Okay.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
John, can I make another suggestion?
Please do.
I would assume, I don't know if the right word's capital or capitalism, is something more like the constructible hierarchy. It's more like V equals L, right? As opposed to an assumption of a cardinal above that. And what I mean by that is, I think the metaphor, you know, if you were taking a non-anti-capitalist view, one way you could define it is V equals L, the creation of things which didn't exist prior, funded by capital. I don't know, let's make up one in the world, mRNA, right? You know, vaccines or whatever it is. That's the forcing, the generic forcing that occurs as a result, you know, beyond on the other side of that ledger, right? That's the Cohen to capital's girdle.
That's absolutely the way in which it makes more intuitive sense to me. So
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat what John said in another way? I mean, I understood part of that. I just want to make sure that I really absorb that.
At the risk of brutal oversimplification, if my suggestion was capital is kind of like the first inaccessible cardinal, John replied, isn't capital more like V equals L? And I quite agree that's the more natural analogy for me to make, which is why I was struck by him using the language of inaccessibility in the part that we just read to describe capital, right? So that's what I was trying to make sense of. But really, I'm with you, John, and the steps to mediate the two, I can only think of two things right now that we should probably bear in mind. And maybe we're pushing the analogies beyond their breaking point. I'm not sure. I hope not. One is that V equals L one is that the level of an inaccessible cardinal in what we would call reality in V is still compatible with V equals L. So the two interpretations are not mutually excluding in that
Yep,
sense.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
And the other is that weird point, and I'm not sure how to fit this in, but intuitively, I want to say that weird point that I mentioned earlier perhaps belongs here as well, which is that what L calls inaccessibles certainly exist in L, and are deeply perverse in a way that that precisely constrains it constrains the width of the generic, right? It doesn't think it constrains height, but it dramatically constrains the width of the generic by collapsing the power set to only the constructible subsets. And when we look at that from the outside, we can see its V equals L-ish dimension, because in fact, all of those things that it's calling inaccessible are merely characterized by being uncountable. So its version of transcendence looked at from the outside can be demystified. I'm kind of just flailing around there. But
why does it make the declaration that it's uncountable?
No.
Why is it
Okay.
uncountable? How does that work?
Is it just the term uncountable that's clear? Unclear?
I think so. If you could answer that, it could help me clarify it in a broader sense.
Sure. So being countable is just having the same cardinality as the lowest infinity, omega or aleph 0 or bet 0. That's all it means. So the natural numbers are paradigmatically countable, whether you count 0 as a natural number or not, it has. Okay, as soon as you take the power set operator the first time, so in our view, in our philosophical view, as soon as you move from V omega to V omega plus 1, smallest possible movement within the hierarchy, you get the power set of countable infinity. Let's say the power set of that 0, which is that 1. And by Cantor's theorem, this is 2 to the beth 0, and 2 to the beth 0 is dramatically larger than beth 0. So this is uncountable. But that's a very, so I've talked about how, in a way, all of this is to come to the rescue of this idea of the power set being uncountable. But in a very literal sense, just obeying the power set axiom, this is a very low-level characteristic of infinite sets. The first infinite set that we can produce by the power set operation is already uncountable, right? So all of the sets of ZFC in reality, all the sets whose existence can be proven by ZFC, almost all of them are already uncountable. And in ZFC, an inaccessible is something much larger than merely an uncountable set. They're still uncountable, that's fine. But being inaccessible is much larger than being uncountable, right? So an inaccessible lives here. whereas our first uncountable set lives right here at v omega plus 1. They're all uncountable beyond that. So now we can see, I think, just how perverse L is if we reflect upon it from the outside. Because as far as L is concerned, I'd normally draw L inside V here, but that would be messy. As far as L is concerned, this terribly large point, what L calls inaccessible, actually just means, looked at from the outside, uncountable. So in a certain sense, we've got one of those critical points that's raised by squeezing, right? When we squeeze V into L, it's as if the first uncountable cardinal has been promoted to the level of being inaccessible, but the system has no way to say that from the inside.
Yeah, by design.
Yes, exactly.
So I have a quick take on this question of the accessible finite of capital and its sort of repetition of buying and selling. Is you could think of the problem of economism, which is the idea that if we just had more trade unions and they fought for better wages, that society would transform itself and capitalism would just be more yada, yada, yada. It doesn't really pan out in anything salient. If you go to 199 in the text, I do sort of, this is the concept of covering over, phenomenology of covering over, recouvrement. He's talking about this, and you think about what economism poses within capitalism. It's not a threat. There's nothing to cover over. It's just more and more capitalism. You're just trying to sell your wages, your labor power at a better price. So there's effectively no new infinity in the situation. But when you talk about it in terms of what he says at the very top there, it's the first full paragraph to the second full paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the idea, in other words, we are transforming the logic of the problem of emancipation. We are revising the way we understand the formal intelligibility of the process of liberation, whereby humanity takes charge of its own history. Indeed, without any way refuting the great eschatological vision of classical Marxism, skipping, we are no longer treating its concrete sequence directly as an explicit contradiction between disjoint and separate terms such as oppressor and oppressed. So that's, again, a completely, the way capital just reframes that sort of situation. It's just buyers and sellers. You just
Right.
labor power better.
But it's also Badiou going against worldview Marxism, which is fine. Only he can do it.
Right.
But you want to continue on that? That's actually really great.
Yeah, so I'll continue skipping down. It says, if this necessary relationship between the forms of oppression and the exact nature of what the dominant groups fear the most is not brought to light, it becomes impossible to understand the erratic, event-driven course of history of class conflict. And the result is that the dominant oligarchy will continue to implement in a strictly structural and always invisible way its own particular figure of oppression. So again, if you're going by this sort of economistic reading of how we should struggle, right, for better wages, better working conditions, and what's ultimately going to transform society, then capitalism is just going to let you continue to do that because it poses no significant threat. That's what I got.
Yeah, that's helpful. I like that. I mean, of course, there's like a million Marxist rebuttals to discuss and raise and things, but that's a very significant passage. We should return to that. And of course, as you guys may or may not know, there's incredible treatment of Maoism towards the very end of the book and the Cultural Revolution, a huge revisitation that we should at later points address when we feel ready to. In other words, there's a lot of Marxism in this book.
And you can see on this page also how my desire for an epiphany isn't completely misplaced, right? The risk is that capital becomes noticeable, And yes, it only becomes noticeable in being opposed, but its being noticeable seems to me as essential as it's being opposed if we're going to have a politics based on the notion of truth, and not based on simply the notion of competing interests, some of which are broader, maybe some of which are even universal in the sense of including everybody, but are still just interests, like Oliver Wendell Holmes' view of labor. Well, if it wins, then it's right. So the danger is that the invisible.
Sorry, John, continue.
So the danger is that the invisible in the middle of the page there will become noticeable, and that only happens a few lines from the bottom of that paragraph when there is the unusual emergence of an infinite point from which the finitude of oppression can be seen. And finitude of oppression is ambiguous there, right? When you live in the world of oppression, it's the world of finitude. But the structure of oppression is something like that first infinite. It is what it denies, I think. Sorry, John, please go on.
I was going to just make another finite, infinite understanding of markets, right? So within capitalism, as opposed to either or, with respect to communism, you can see this idea of, I don't know if you guys know what the efficient market hypothesis is, right? It's this idea that markets perfectly price assets or capital, markets perfectly price the value of things, right? So the idea being, though, if everything was priced perfectly, markets would have no transactions, right? That's one of the logical conclusions from that, because it means that, you know, everyone knows the price, and so they're not buying or selling things to discover price. So this discovery mechanism, I think, i.e. the market buying and selling, is because no one actually knows the true price, is the transfinite order of the hierarchy. You know, it's the cardinal higher than whatever capital itself would be as a dollar value, or however you would put it. Like the market transactions themselves, right, are working to try and reveal something which is unknown and can't be known, or else there would be no transactions.
This
Well,
is
you also have
fascinating.
to ask,
Please.
to say that you have to ask the fundamental question of what is the price of labor, right? This is where people always trip up on labor theory of value. It's not trying to describe how much labor is worth in creating a commodity. It's what is the price of the commodity of labor when you apply your labor theory of value to it.
I thought it was the gap between those.
Well, again, if labor produces value, then, and if labor produces the value of a commodity, the question then becomes, if labor is also a commodity, what is the labor necessary to produce the commodity of labor? And then how do you value that?
I'm really naive about this, but I thought the gap between the two was surplus value, and that you can only see that by comparing the two.
The gap is in the exchange. When I exchange my labor power and you make a profit off of the commodity sold, then that's the surplus you take and you pay me out a wage, which is incommensurate with that value. But then labor theory of value wants to argue that, well, if commodity, and this is kind of a tangential discussion, I'm literally getting ready for work right now. If this is uninteresting, we can move on. Sorry, it's just a tangential side note. But yeah, just in general, if you apply labor theory of value to the commodity that is labor, then you can't account for that value. It's Ingalls' remark in the introduction to wage labor capital.
That's fascinating, and I need to understand this better. So
could we do that in the Zulip? I'd like to make sure I understand that too.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I'll share the political economy book by Yao and Tupanamba as well. The Baju and it's a very dense book, but definitely worth looking into. And
John, I'd also like to talk more about what seems like a weird duality between the efficient market hypothesis, as you describe it, and the socialist calculation problem. right? They seem to be dealing with all of the same
Yeah.
moving parts, but
Yeah,
to have
absolutely.
an inverse valuation of in what the problem lies.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love that too, because you could take a Marxist view where a perfectly efficient market is one where like labor is given its exact fair share. So if the fair share is known, there's no transactional value in it, right? So like it could be that perfect market. Anyway, it's
Yeah, but again, that's the dream of
if I
getting out a
understood,
fair wage, is that even if I get a fair wage for my labor, you still get surplus value. And what I do with my wages is I reproduce myself as a worker, whereas you as the capitalist accumulate more capital, get more factories, hire more labor, and expand your empire.
well, I see that we're over time. Is that right? Yeah. Perhaps for inaccessibles keep getting slightly kicked down the road, but I wonder if I might take us through a forced march of the cardinal concepts next time, and then open it maybe in the second hour to a broader discussion of how this hooks up to the truth procedure.
I think we should also try
but
to.
of course, it might not work out that way.
I think it might be good also to try to assign the volunteer for the second hour to walk us through. I think somebody wanted to do some work on the poems, if I heard that right. Did you say somebody signed up for that, or?
I said that someone volunteered to talk about that composition, Missing on Blackbird,
perfect.
that shows up in one of the later sections.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
But I would love to. I would love it if people.
I would like to
talk
sign up
more
to.
about their
I would like
interests.
to. I would like to talk about Badiou and the use of poetry in Mandelstam, Emily Dickinson, and Hugo. Just if that's okay, because I think I've taken a class with him on poetry, and he teaches poetry more than he doesn't teach mathematics. I mean, he teaches poetry a lot. So it might be cool to say a few things about that.
Huzzah, do it. That would be fantastic.
Okay, cool.
So next time we'll have the matheme and the poem, and poor love and politics will fall through the gap. No, we'll try not to make that true. All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
This was great.
thanks so much.
Sorry, question? Did somebody have a question? No? Okay, sorry. We will see you in not next week, but the week after, right, John?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.